If you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible. Just click the link in the description.
Welcome to Mind Shock. Today we are looking at the argument from false premise. What is a false premise? How rampant are false premises in arguments in the day-to-day and as well in advanced physics, in conspiratorial examinations, in anything really? And why do false premises not get enough attention? Because when you're arguing from a false premise, it's still theoretically possible to accidentally arrive at the correct conclusion, and I'll explain how that works. But in general, the whole argument is fallacious, so there's no reason to really pretend it's not, and a lot of people even attempt to discuss in good faith without identifying the false premise of someone making a particular argument. So, of course, if you're interested in logic and reason and the truth about anything, you would have to understand logical fallacies, and you'd have to understand, especially false premises, and how they come to be. I mean, most of it's just a result of such severe indoctrination that most people don't even consider the possibility that they could be arguing from a false premise. As always, if you enjoy the Mind Shock podcast, you find it interesting and informative, you can support the podcast, donate to our PayPal, just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit that bell for notifications. Make sure you allow your device to have those notifications come through. You can also just go to youtube.com/MindShock. Like and share this particular podcast to help bring logic and reason to a world that is becoming more and more bereft of it. As the days go by, just take a look around and you can see how evident that is. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comments section. All I ask is that you at least understand the information being presented first. Otherwise, again, it's just not going to be a fruitful discussion. However, if you do want to serve as an example for Dunning-Kruger or various fallacies, then feel free to post even without understanding what was presented. You could also share the podcast on other social media platforms, of which you could also find us on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic logical analysis, co-podcaster requests. You could also be a guest on the podcast depending on your tier. All right, so let me just go over a really quick false premise that could still lead to something correct. So, for example, let's say someone believes that all cars are living things, are organic material, and a car is a type of animal belonging to the animal kingdom. So they might reason, okay, so animals need sustenance. They need water to survive. Therefore, cars also need some kind of sustenance, possibly gasoline. So then they fuel up their car to have it run, and they fully believe that a car is a living, breathing animal of some kind. So their premise was false, that a machine is an animal belonging to the animal kingdom. However, the reasoning accidentally ended up basically at an argument that turned a conclusion that is relatively true. Cars need some kind of energy to run off of, whether that's gasoline through a combustion engine or some kind of battery if it's electric powered. Regardless, even though their premise was incorrect about a vehicle being a living, breathing animal, their premise was incorrect. Their conclusion was correct, that it does need some kind of power. And you see this all the time in practically every scientific field. Now, the cult of scientism maintains that because things work or can be predicted, that must mean that the base premise and the theory is correct. Obviously, that's as silly nonsense as you can get. And the scientism cultists fail to see even the very basics of these arguments with false premises. Now, another place false premises, again, if you're an avid Mind Shock listener, we cover a lot of true crime on Mind Shock. False premises are also rampant in true crime where, we discussed the Maura Murray case. We have an extensive podcast, probably the most in-depth logical podcast out there on the Maura Murray case. If you're operating with the false premise or a possibly false premise that Maura Murray left UMass, ended up in New Hampshire, that might not be true. So you have a premise that may be false. So if you believe, for example, Rick Forcier, she knocked on Rick Forcier's door and he harmed her, you're operating off of a premise that she actually was in that area. or if you're operating off a premise that the so-called car accident wasn't staged. Again, a lot of variables. In any true crime case, you have these premises that could be false. Now, and that's a whole nother category where you're not sure if the premise is true or false. Now, the other thing I want to mention, of course, is that arguing from a false premise doesn't make someone a liar unless they know the premise is false and they're not arguing in good faith, which also happens. But a large percent of the time, possibly the majority of the time, people are arguing off a false premise without realizing it. For example, if you watch a lot of hours on the Idiot Box, you might just naturally assume that Pasteur's germ theory is correct. And that contagion has been definitively proven, and that is the mechanism by which viruses or so-called viruses work. Now, again, I'm not saying it's true or not true, but if it's a false premise, and for example, Antoine Béchamp's theory is true, and cellular or terrain theory is actually what's going on, you have a lot of the field of medicine built on a false premise. So that's just yet another one of endless examples where people don't even consider the possibility that they could be operating off of a false premise. And a lot of that has to do with mental weakness, of course. Most people are unable to examine things outside of their subjectively perceived comfort zone, and which correlates to their perception of reality. For example, some people don't want to even consider that we're living in a simulation. It just makes them feel uncomfortable, that their whole life is basically a lie and there's some kind of video game character in a simulated reality that's not even real. They can't handle it. So they have to either pretend it's not a possibility, or just ignore it and deny the possibility. You see this in every facet of argumentation, especially concerning so-called conspiracy theories. Although you're going to have to find some new conspiracy theories, because all the old ones basically have come true the past few years. I mean, the Alex Jones was right jar is packed to capacity at this point. I mean, the most supposedly labeled psychotic claims from Alex Jones, everything from frogs to organ harvesting of the unborn, it's all now being reported in mainstream newspapers over the past few years. And the coincidence theorists will still maintain that he's wrong about everything, or he's only right about one or two things, when the tally is so far in his favor. And again, I am not advocating Alex Jones is legitimate in any way. He could be a complete psychotic who was accidentally right about all these things. But the point is, the coincidence theorists that were too mentally weak to even honestly examine any of the claims for veracity, they just immediately defaulted to ad hominem logical fallacies, appeal to incredulity logical fallacies, appeal to humor logical fallacies. They just desperately grasped at any faith and fallacies they could to dismiss Alex Jones's claims without honestly, logically, and objectively examining them for merit. And maybe he didn't have the evidence to back it up at the time that he said it. Maybe he did. I don't know. He's always screaming about documents. But regardless of whether he had the evidence or not, if he ended up being correct, obviously, even if accidentally correct, obviously there was an issue there with coincidence theorists who were too mentally weak to even examine the possibility. And they will never know the truth, of course, because they're too mentally weak and or illogical to objectively analyze any information. So with false premises, it's very, very important to always examine your own premises. If accuracy is your goal, if you're not a propaganda mouthpiece or just a Dunning-Kruger goof, hopelessly worshiping authorities that indoctrinated you in indoctrination facilities, and all these expert talking heads on the Idiot Box, of course, completely ignoring all the experts that don't get airtime on the mainstream media. But anyway, with false premises, if the truth is your goal, you have to always, always be cognizant of your own premises. What information are you operating with? I reference a house of cards many, many times, and that's basically shining light on a possible false premise or some kind of false reasoning along the way, because if you're building a foundation of shaky cards, it's not going to hold up very well, because when the truth comes, it's going to blow the whole house of cards over, and it's very easy to blow over if it's not actually built on substance, if it's not actually built on scientific fact. If it's only built on faith, fallacies, assumptions, and false premises, it's going to be very easy to blow over. Now again, that doesn't mean someone isn't accidentally correct. So even operating with false premises, people can still be correct and provide functional information that accurately represents something. They just don't know why. And that's basically the main criticism of the religion of scientism, our main dominant religion of the world. You have goofs claiming that because cell phones work, that means man walked on the moon. Or because cell phones work, the earth can't be flat. I mean, again, I'm not advocating the earth is flat. I just find those arguments so hilarious, mostly from the globe earthers. And that's just, again, for anybody interested in developing logic. Again, not about conclusions, but just in terms of lines of reasoning and logical fallacies, flat earth debates are really the best and most entertaining to develop that. Because what one piece of technology has to do with some kind of worldview, there's really no correlation there. And then people say, oh, well, what about all the communication through the satellites? That's another example of a false premise, because, again, maybe it's not true, but it's openly admitted by all tech companies and governments that something like between 97 and 99.9% of all worldwide communications are by underwater fiber optics lines. And you have all these goofy NASA worshipers, that these Church of NASA zealots, they always use this argument, oh, we wouldn't be able to communicate without the satellites in orbit. Well, if even NASA's own documentation, as well as all these other tech companies and governments, are showing, like, you can even look at the maps of the undersea cables. You can find videos of the cables being laid. And then, so where's the other 1 to 3%? Are we going to pretend cell phone towers don't deliver communications? Are we going to hallucinate that none of these telephone lines or above ground fiber optics lines and people's cable, they don't exist? So when you add that all up together, I mean, how much, again, I'm not saying that there are no satellites. Obviously, the burden of proof is on the one making the claim, and or how satellites would prove a globe Earth, because obviously you could have satellites up there over a flat plane as well. But just the point is, that's an interesting false premise that all communication, or a majority, or even a substantial piece, even 10% of communications are done through satellites in orbit. Nobody's even claiming that. So another one of the endless examples of false premises. And if you're building an entire argument on a false premise, even if you're correct about the conclusion, either accidentally or because of other reasons, that doesn't mean it's not a false premise. So false premises, always need to keep an eye on those. And it's always curious too, because people, especially scientists, cultists, or coincidence theorists arguing for whatever they saw in the idiot box being true without any critical thinking being applied, they always get triggered when you examine their premise. Because their subconscious recognizes that the premise could be false. Even if it's not false, the fact that they couldn't substantiate the premise and built an argument, again, on a house of cards, that triggered them, and you can see their reaction. It's very, very hilarious. Happens all the time. And if you're arguing for truth, be prepared to have your own premise be examined. Of course, the truth is not afraid of investigation. So if your premise is really that sound, you would have no problem with anybody questioning it, because you'd be able to prove that the premise is true and then move on to the argument built from that base premise. So I hope you guys found another edition of the MINDSHOCK podcast informative in logical fallacies, so you can debate others in a non-fallacious manner. Let's bring logic and reason back to a world that seems to have abandoned it. If you enjoy the podcast, find it informative, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Hit that bell for notifications. Like and share this podcast. Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons do get priority for case topic logical analysis, co-podcaster requests. You can also be a guest in the podcast depending on your tier. So you can also support MINDSHOCK by becoming a patron. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. This is Bruce McGuire signing off. Catch you guys next time.